guys, welcome back to my video. So right now we are going to be doing this. Alright, and first one of these books I'm gonna do is this first one right here. Right, perfect.
Little Miss
Oops. Continue.
Whoops by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Whoops is one of those people who have accidents all the time. She has lots of little accidents, like when she is trying to make lunch and drops the eggs. Whoops. And she has big accidents, like when she painted her bedroom and tripped over the paint pot.
Here, let's make this bigger.
Every morning, when she makes her cup of tea, she spills the milk, tips over the sugar bowl, drops the tea bag, breaks the biscuits, knocks her cup of tea across the table, and has to start all over again. Whoops! Some days it can take hours before she leaves the house. Little Miss Whoops really is the most accident-prone person in the world. Well, not quite. Little Miss Whoops has a brother, Mr. Bump. He is just like his sister, if not worse, but that is another story which you may have read. Each year, Little Miss Whoops travels by train to visit her brother for a week. She set off last Tuesday. This Tuesday, Mr. Bump looked at his clock, which was lying on the ground. He had just knocked it over. His sister was late, a whole week late. And why was Little Miss Whoops late? A whole chapter of accidents, of course. While her train was waiting in a station, she somehow or other tripped and fell out of the train. Whoops! And then she somehow or other tripped and fell into the back of a lorry, which took her to Seatown. Whoops! Where somehow or other she tripped and fell into a boat, which took her to another country. Whoops! She had to wait nearly a week to get another boat back. And another lorry. And another train. Little Miss Whoops was exhausted by the time she finally reached her brother's house. "I thought you were coming last week," said Mr. Bump. "It must have been a long trip." "It was," said Little Miss Whoops. "Would you like a cup of tea?" offered Mr. Bump. And you know what that involved, don't you? They spilled the milk, tipped over the sugar bowl, dropped the tea bags, broke the biscuits, and knocked the tea all over the table. What a mess! Whoops! "Oh, look at the time," cried Little Miss Whoops, knocking over the clock. "I've got to go if I'm to catch my train home." She grabbed her suitcase and rushed out of the door. "Goodbye," she called. "Goodbye," called back Mr. Bump. "See you next year." Mr. Bump waved from the doorway until she had rounded the corner. Then he closed the door. But as he did, the door handle came off in his hand. "Whoops," said Mr. Bump.
Cool. Alright. this. And this. Alright. Now let's do Little Miss Tiny. Let's do Little Miss Tiny. Oops.
Little Miss Tiny by Rhoda Hargreaves. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small, not very tall at all. She was so very tiny she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole in the dining room of Home Farm. She had made the mouse hole quite comfortable, really, and luckily there weren't any mice because the farm cat had chased them all away. The trouble was, because she was so tiny, nobody knew she lived there. Nobody had noticed her, not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived, all alone, with nobody to talk to. She was very lonely and sad. Oh dear. One day, she was feeling so lonely she decided to be very brave and go for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came. She crept across the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hall. To Little Miss Tiny, the hall looked as big as a field, and she scuttled across it to the back of the door of the farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox was at the bottom of the door, and she squeezed herself through it and onto the doorstep. It was all very exciting. There before her was the farmyard, and she went exploring. She came to a door with a gap at the bottom and ducked in underneath. There inside was a pig, a large pig. And if you're as small as Little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Miss Tiny looked at the pig. The pig looked at Miss Tiny. Oink, he grunted and moved closer to inspect this little person who had entered his sty. Oh my goodness me, squeaked Little Miss Tiny in alarm, and shot out of the pigsty as fast as ever her little legs would carry her, which wasn't very fast because her legs were so very little. She ran right round to the back of the pigsty before she stopped. She leaned against the wall, put her hand over her eyes, trying to get her breath back. Suddenly she heard a noise, a very close noise, a sort of breathing noise, very close indeed. Oh, she hardly dared take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did, she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was? There, right in front of her, looking at her with green eyes. Ginger, the farm cat. Poor Little Miss Tiny. Ginger grinned, showing his teeth. Help! Shrieked Miss Tiny at the top of her voice. Oh, somebody, please help! The trouble was, the top of Little Miss Tiny's voice was not a very loud place. Ginger grinned another grin. Every day Mr. Strong went to Home Farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs, lots of them. That day he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again, round the corner. He looked round the corner and saw Ginger and the poor trapped Little Miss Tiny. Shoo, said Mr. Strong to Ginger, and picked up Little Miss Tiny very gently. Hello, he said. Who are you? I'm Miss Tiny. You are, aren't you? Smiled Mr. Strong. Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't go wandering around large farmyards. But, said Miss Tiny, and told Mr. Strong about how she was so lonely she had come to find out somebody to talk to. Oh dear, said Mr. Strong. Well now, let's see if we can't find you some friends to talk to. And now, every week, Mr. Strong collects Little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see her friends. 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she just couldn't stop laughing all day. 2 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favourite meal. But that's much, much too much for tiny little me, she laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. For you, he said, divide by 100. Last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly, and Mr. Silly showed her how to stand on your head. That's very silly, giggled Little Miss Tiny. Thank you, replied Mr. Silly modestly. And guess who she met this week? somebody who's become a special little friend. I never thought I'd meet anybody smaller than myself, laughed Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled. You wait till I grow up, she said.
That was a cute book. Alright, let's go get this out of here. Do Little Miss Tidy. Yeah, Little Miss Tidy. Let's do this one right here. Let's do it in a row. Alright. Don't forget, you guys, I'm Lily's Gaming.
Little Miss Tidy by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Tidy was an extraordinarily tidy person. In Little Miss Tidy's house, everything had its place. She had a huge handbag, which she would fill with all sorts of things until she had time to put them away tidily. Then there were all her boxes. She had small ones, medium-sized ones, big ones, enormous ones, round ones, and square ones. And this was where Little Miss Tidy tidied away all her things. Nothing was ever left lying around in her house. Now, with all this tidying up going on, you would think that Little Miss Tidy was perfect, wouldn't you? Well, she isn't. On Monday at 9 o'clock, she telephoned Mr. Clever. As you are so clever, she said, could you tell me where I put my hairbrush when I tidied up? On Tuesday at 10 o'clock, she telephoned Mr. Mean. As you like money so much, she said, could you tell me where I put my purse when I tidied up? On Wednesday at 11 o'clock, she telephoned Mr. Strong. As you like eggs so much, she said, could you tell me where I put my boiled egg when I tidied up? On Thursday at 12 o'clock, she telephoned Mr. Nosy. As you are always poking your nose into things, she said, could you tell me where I put my serving spoon when I tidied up? On Friday, she didn't telephone anybody because she had tidied away her telephone, and she had to run all the way to Little Miss Chatterbox's house. As you love using the telephone, she said, could you tell me where I put my telephone when I tidied up? Luckily, thanks to her friends, Little Miss Tidy was able to find all the things she had lost that week. Her hairbrush was in a glove box, her purse was in a shoe box, her boiled egg was in the salt pot, her serving spoon was in the toolbox, and her telephone was in her sewing box. Little Miss Tidy certainly was very absent-minded when it came to remembering where she had put things when she was tidying up, but she couldn't help it. On Saturday, it was her birthday, and Little Miss Chatterbox came to her house carrying a splendid-looking parcel, all tied up with red ribbon. Little Miss Tidy couldn't wait to see what was inside the present. It was a notebook and pencil, the perfect present for somebody who lost things as easily as Little Miss Tidy. Little Miss Tidy was as happy as Mr. Happy. She spent the rest of the day opening all her boxes and writing down in her notebook everything that she had stored away in them. It was very late by the time she had finished her list. She went to bed
This book
very
is
tired.
cute. I like this book.
On Sunday morning she woke with a start. My notebook and pencil, she cried. Wherever did I put them when I tidied up? Little Miss Tidy spent all day Sunday looking for her notebook and pencil. She had to open and close all her boxes again. Do you know where she eventually found her notebook and pencil?
Okay, you guys.
On a bedside table.
We're gonna go back.
She eventually found her notebook and pencil on her bedside table. Eventually found her notebook and pencil
There, come see it now.
on her bedside table.
Let's do Little Miss Help. Little Miss Help.
Little Miss Helpful by Rudder Hargrave.
Oh, helpful. Okay.
Little Miss Helpful was one of those people who love to help other people, but who end up helping nobody. Do you know what I mean? I mean, for instance, like the time when one of Mr. Tall's shoelaces came undone. Now, if you're as tall as Mr. Tall, tying your shoelaces isn't the easiest thing in the world, as you can imagine. "Let me help," cried Little Miss Helpful, rushing up. Then, somehow, she managed to tie Mr. Tall's shoelaces together, and he fell over. And if you're as tall as Mr. Tall, falling over hurts. Bang! "Ouch," he said, rubbing his head. "Let me help," cried Little Miss Helpful, and rushed off to get some sticking plaster, and rushed back and stuck it on Mr. Tall, over his mouth. He said. He was trying to say, "Take it off," but that's rather difficult to do with sticking plaster stuck over your mouth. Little Miss Helpful looked at him with concern. "Let me help," she cried, and ripped the sticking plaster off his mouth. "Ow!" he cried. "That hurt." "Would you like me to get some cream for your sore mouth?" she asked anxiously. "No," he groaned. "Go away." Now, do you know what I mean about people like Little Miss Helpful, who help nobody? Last year, in April, I think it was, Mr. Happy woke up feeling not very well. The doctor had to be called, and he came to Mr. Happy's house, which is on a hill by a lake. "Oh dear," said the doctor when he saw Mr. Happy. "Measles." Mr. Happy's face fell. "Now you're to stay nice and warm in bed and get lots of rest and take this medicine 3 times a day," said the doctor, and went. Mr. Happy settled down to sleep. He'd just fallen asleep when there was a loud knock at his front door. "Oh dear," groaned Mr. Happy, and staggered off to open it. You can guess who it was, can't you? "I've come to help," she cried. "But," protested Mr. Happy. "But nothing," cried Little Miss Helpful. "Now off to bed with you while I get on with everything." She looked around. "This place needs a good clean," she said. Mr. Happy had just dropped off to sleep again when Miss Helpful poked her head round his bedroom door. "Have you got a scrubbing brush?" she asked. Poor Mr. Happy had to get up and show her where it was, and then he went back to bed to sleep.
This book is
Little Miss
so
Helpful stepped back to admire the
amazing.
kitchen floor she'd just scrubbed, and trod on the soap, and fell head over heels, and got her head stuck in the bucket, and, because she couldn't see where she was going, walked into a shelf full of saucepans, which fell all over the floor with a terrible clatter. And, because she couldn't see where she was going, Little Miss Helpful stepped in one of the saucepans and got it stuck on her foot, and because she had a hop, she fell over against the refrigerator door, which flew open, and everything inside fell out, all over Little Miss Helpful. Poor Mr. Happy awoke with a jump at the terrible commotion. He groaned, got out of bed, went to the kitchen and opened the door. He couldn't believe his eyes. There, in the middle of a pile of broken eggs and a scrubbing brush and rolling saucepans and a lot of water and spilt milk and squashed butter and bent saucepan lids and a piece of soap, sat Little Miss Helpful with a bucket on her head and a saucepan on her foot. "Help!" came a voice from inside the bucket. Mr. Happy seized the bucket and pulled as hard as ever he could, and pulled and pulled. Pop! The bucket came off the top of Little Miss Helpful's head like a cork out of a bottle. Mr. Happy shot backwards like a bullet from a gun. Crash! He went flying through the kitchen door. He shot across the garden and straight through the garden hedge. He rolled down the field behind his garden, faster and faster, and splash! He finished up in the lake with the bucket in his hand, and a little figure with a saucepan on one foot came half running, half hopping out of Mr. Happy's house. "Let me help," she cried.
Cool. Let's do Little Miss Fun. trying to press the button. Right.
Little Miss Fun by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Fun is as happy as a lark, except when she is organising a party. And then she is even happier than a lark. Little Miss Fun simply adores parties, and she likes to invite lots and lots of people to her parties. The other Sunday, there were a lot of people making their way to Little Miss Fun's house. Mr. Funny was making funny faces, Mr. Lazy was yawning, Mr. Clumsy was falling over, and Mr. Tall was walking in very small steps, so he would not arrive too early. Mr. Forgetful was not with them. He was at home reading a book. He had forgotten all about Little Miss Fun's party. Never mind, laughed Little Miss Fun. We can start the party without him. She put a record on the record player. The record went round and round, and the music played. Little Miss Fun asked Mr. Clumsy to dance with her, and he accepted. Unfortunately, he stood on her right foot. Never mind, she laughed. Then she ran off to ask Mr. Lazy to dance. Unfortunately, when he put his head on her shoulder, he fell asleep and almost flattened her. Never mind, she laughed. In less than an hour, Little Miss Fun had made everybody dance. The rumba and the samba, the rock and roll and the twist, the charleston and the cha-cha-cha. Then she led everybody out into the garden, and they danced all around the house. All the flowers in the garden were trampled.
Hold on.